Welcome back to our Advent calendar, our first Advent, December 1st. I am here with Pastor Joe and myself, Shane, if you didn't already guess that, or if this is one of your first videos that you've checked out with Redeemer Online. So we're excited. We're going to sit here tonight and have a discussion, both about our Sunday sermon, but also as well the whole purpose kind of behind this Advent calendar, how this happened, and how we sort of arrived on this topic of hope and hopefulness. So, so welcome. If you haven't seen Sunday's message, that is available in our videos. Just go ahead and go back to that, click that, have a look at that first. It will probably help make sense a little bit of our round discussion here.
Sure. Although they maybe hears things here that they're like, no, fast, wait for the next one.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's a good point. So, anyways, we don't really have a format for this. Neither one of us has ever really done this. We just want this to be casual, us as two pastors reflecting on both what we heard from the Sunday sermon and also what we hear God doing, both in the midst of this Advent season, but also in the midst of our community specifically. We do serve here at Redeemer CRC in Sarnia. And so you'll hear pieces of that interwoven into our conversation here too.
Well, and I think some of the goal too, right? Like, I mean, you've written a number of sermons, right? Like, the reality is the irony of it is that people will go home and digest the sermon that they hear, and they'll scrutinize that under a magnifying glass. But already that's just a fraction of the content that we could have passed along or written out or explained. So like Shane mentioned, right? Like some of it is to talk about Sunday, but not in the way that I think most families probably do shortly after a service is done, where they say, "Hey, what'd you think of the sermon?" "Oh yeah, it was pretty good." "Yeah, pretty good." Or, "Oh, that guy was boring as wallpaper. Let's skip the next one." Or like whatever.
We've all made those comments, even us.
So of our own too, I'm sure.
Sure.
But the goal here, right, is there stuff that never makes it to the page.
Sure.
And so, like, what kind of choices do we make as we're writing these sermons?
Yeah.
And
Well, maybe a surefire way to get oriented here would maybe be, how about you walk us through Sunday? Hit on possibly your highlights, what you felt was most important from Sunday, and let's talk about that.
Yeah. So, I mean, some of the eye candy of the sermon evaluation is always the visual piece, right? Like what you're seeing and perceiving. And prior to COVID, I would never have rewatched many of my sermons. I maybe have listened to a handful of them, right? But now I'll spend hours not editing the actual flow of a sermon, but editing everything around it. And as a result, you end up listening to it while you're making other changes. And one of the things that I noticed was that on an energy level, things were a little lower this week than other weeks. Some of that's coming off of a couple weeks vacation. It's not always easy to jump back into things, but the real thing is actually the length was just a little bit long. And I had a story on the front that really had some energy, just talking about knowing saintly people in different communities, and then wanting to introduce Simeon and Anna in a similar light. But by the time you've edited it and put all the other bits on, it was pushing almost 50 minutes, and it was like, okay, yeah, we need to cut something or re-record something. But I was pretty content with the information that came out with the rest of it. So I ended up just cutting off that. But as a result, you missed the sort of smiley, let's get into the sermon piece. Yeah. So.
Yeah, well, I think I actually like that direction that you went, especially for this first Sunday of Advent, at least for me, especially as I listened to the sermon and thought about this season of waiting, which is what Advent is defined as. We wait in anticipation of the coming Christ, and we celebrate the coming Christ. I liked that tie to how Simeon and Anna are waiting. They're waiting for the coming Messiah, and how you related that to these saints of the faith who have been in faith for their entire lifetimes and have been in waiting for that coming Savior. And we know, we have the whole New Testament, we have the whole story. but the faith displayed and the grace displayed, as the term that you used
Sure.
by Anna, in that waiting, and waiting with such hope, and
Right.
I liked it because I feel like for the season of our life and a lot of the reflection of our congregants as we meet with them, has been how difficult it is becoming to wait. The reality of our environment is that we're in the midst of COVID. COVID was the whole thing that sparked this Advent calendar, and
Yeah.
and I think now that we're nearly 9 months into this, it becomes more and more difficult to wait. Every day becomes, it seems, as in our own lives, the patience is just so ragged and so thin.
Well, and as you're interacting with the story as it sits in Scripture too, right? Like, I think that's one of the pieces that I marvel at with Simeon and Anna is that, like, I really love that Anna's not just old in the story; she's very old, like this, like ancient relic, and yet she has this joyous sort of. I imagine her to be this kind of like joy-filled, bouncing around, just those pleasant people that you meet, and it doesn't matter how miserable your day has been. They just they meet you and they greet you, and you're like, oh, I'm loved, and this is wonderful and joyful, right?
Yeah.
Like, and
that's
it's not
the best part of grandmas.
Yeah, and
I mean, like, they're so just naturally they're wired that way,
and it's not cheap, or it's not stingy,
exactly.
right? Like, or disingenuine or fake, right? Like,
right. Yeah.
It's just it's this joy that just lives in her heart, right? And anyways, I marvel at the length of time in which they're waiting. Even Simeon, right? Like, we don't get he's not introduced as very old, but I mean, he is introduced with his own words of saying, "Look, I had a revelation from the Spirit that said, you're not going to die until you see the Savior born."
Yeah.
And he says, "Look, I've seen it. My life's over."
Yeah.
Which automatically we assume older because we don't. Life doesn't expect us to pass away younger, although more than enough people do. But there's this expectation that both of them are these pillars, sort of old pillars of the faith and community, and and I mean, you talked about COVID in this season, but I think that's one thing too that never made it into the sermon is we really suck at waiting, right? Like, I mean, how. Lockdown sort of started for us here in Southern Ontario around March 15, and I think by end of April, people were angry, frustrated with the wait, and wanting to move on to the next thing, right?
Yeah, I can remember explicit conversations where the person on the other side, I remember having to remind them, look, we're only 2 months into a global pandemic. The last time we experienced that was 1920, so very few of us still have a memory of that. But however, that took 2 years of waiting and patience in which to sort of not return to normal, but at least have some sense of normalcy. In that, we're not all quite so scared, and that time is coming, and that's what's at the heart of the Christmas and Advent season is this period of excitement and anticipation for things being right again. I mean, that is the underlining and ultra pinning aspect of Christianity is that we have this desire for things to be right again, and with the coming Christ, that definitely, the Messiah.
And I think sometimes, and arguably this, I went down a similar path, right, where your anticipating of rightness is end time related, right, where we anticipate the consummation of all things, and the world has been set right on its foundation. Like, there's this transformer on our front lawn.
Okay.
And I think somebody backing out their driveway one day knocked it. And so it was just sitting cockeyed on its concrete base or whatever.
Yeah.
So there's a number to call it. So anyways, we called and somebody just literally just pushed it back in place. But I thought, wow, you've got enough electricity to kill someone, just like off note a little bit, and then somebody just walks up, and I think we wait for creation to be just like back in place.
Yeah.
But what's fascinating to me is in the middle of all this, like the immediate circumstances that people are facing aren't changing, right? Like,
Correct.
And so I think, there's moments where what you read and perceive and understand affects the way you preach, but then there's, gleaning from like what you've studied and the content that other people have written, and one of the things that I think is difficult for me in those moments of trying to articulate that, like, even in the midst of your like circumstances today, we're still hoping for tomorrow, but that hope tomorrow isn't like absent from this moment.
Yeah.
And just navigating that, and I just find that it either becomes a message like, let's hope for everything in the future where everything's just like back in place.
Yeah.
Versus, if you're going through your own personal hell right now, what is the message of this that like lands you?
Yeah.
And the one place that I didn't go, but and some of it because you treat sermons in the scope of their whole series, right? So we're going to have a series which is a sermon which is very much God is with you. Mm-hmm. But that's the hope that I think Simeon and Anna know in their lives firsthand, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I didn't.
Sorry.
Shields up.
Yeah.
I didn't dive into it too in depth. But that when you look at the history of Israel, I bit it off in giant chunks using Matthew's verse 17 there.
Yeah.
But you could have like really painstakingly just done like the intertestamental period of like 400 years until we arrive there, which is kind of the lifespan between Reformation and where we are today. Mm-hmm. And you just think about like all the stuff that would have happened in the seasons of their lives. And yet Simeon and Anna have this like grounded hope. And I wonder if we could push them as like living characters in the story to say, where does this hope draw from? And I can't help but imagine that it's, it's God with us, right?
So I love this. I love this grounding in Simeon and Anna's sort of their patience and Israel and their patience for this coming Messiah. Why was it most important for you, at least, and talk about maybe draw in like how did we arrive on hope? Because I feel like that really sort of paints the background for why that is our topic during this Advent season. Because when we began talking about this back in October and began talking about this concept of Advent and what is Advent supposed to look like this year, why was it that hope was the most important landing spot for you? And what is it that you care most about in the context of that topic?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it was like end of September, maybe even end of August. I had like the camera was spun around, people could see the giant whiteboard with many scribblings on it, but I had like these bubbles, and every bubble basically had its month, and I was trying to brainstorm, what would be an important voice to be heard in those seasons. When the pandemic first started, it was very clear, just like, let's talk about comfort and calling, right? Like, let's do comfort for the sake of the anxiety and the stress of everything that people are dealing with. Let's do comfort that resonates with people who are dealing with loss of life and the tragedy that has been thrust into their lives, pandemic related, but not also. And then let's talk about calling, because so much had become disrupted in our lives that I was convinced that was the opportunity for the church to get up and do something. And some communities really did. Some communities, there were people in their community that they were connected with food, like actual kitchens. They produced food, hundreds or thousands of meals, right? Like here in Sarnia, there were 3 churches that worked together in that way. I only learned about that recently, though. So it's just this interesting reality that, it was this moment where, the Sunday event, if we can de-escalate it from a place of prominence, is canceled. And now it's like, okay, you are still the church, even though your buildings are closed, right? So anyways, you had that kind of visioning, and it was really hard to gauge when that actually became less important. And in some ways, I still think, man, we're still in a season where I could spend my days preaching the same messages over and over of comfort and calling. But one thing that I knew that we were anticipating with Christmas, or that I was anticipating with Christmas, was that the pandemic, would still be here. And I was really expecting there to be a real rise of cases. And as it turns out, unfortunately, that's some of the case. And lockdowns are increasing in more populous areas. We're still fairly okay here, but it's just a matter. I keep telling myself and my family, or anybody who will listen, it's not an if game. It's a matter of when. And so we're in this spot where you see this sort of rising, and people. So as a result, people aren't gathering in their family things. You're not having these big events and galas that would normally happen that help you kind of orient yourself through this season. Even in-person gatherings here at our church, they're basically 2 in the month. And so you don't get even the regular Advent candle lighting piece. And all of that by itself, without any support, feels miserable, I think, for some. For others, they're less bothered by it, and then, you've got everybody in between. And I just thought, there's still hope in all of this, that we're not abandoned in this moment. If you think of the prophetic voice of really Isaiah, for me, has come to life over the last number of months. And, if you connect to some of the stuff on Discord and Facebook, there was a link posted at one point for a PDF document of an Advent devotional, if we could call it that you could be reading. Anyways, that's based on all Isaiah passages. For the same reason that it's just this message of hope for people living in exile and darkness, waiting and wondering when things will be set right. And all of a sudden that what I would find to be a mundane and boring story, all of a sudden is so alive and
comes alive again.
The redundancy of preaching comfort and calling, right? It all just clicks. It's wow.
Yeah.
And that was the story that I cut at the start of the sermon.
Yeah. Well, there's and for obvious reasons, as you can hear from the spelling out of this process of going through and thinking about the sermon and what to include. What you've just talked through is it feels like an entire another topic, and I'm sure it could be
roundtable discussion. In fact,
But my point, where am I going with this? Let's get there. So my point in all of that is that one of the things that I want to kind of zero in on a little bit here and I guess ask a little bit more about it.
Yeah,
is this topic of how things are so different. And everything is different as a result of COVID, and that to me that stuck out as one of the reasons that we wanted to try something different in terms of this Advent season. And one of the things that popped up is a lot of the people in the room already participate in these Advent calendars, and that sort of started to snowball into this idea: how can we as a community maybe have something in which we can flesh out this season of hopefulness as Redeemer? And I think one of the things that I really like that's culminated from that, and one of the things that I think we've really driven throughout this process of trying to create a diversified experience, if you will, throughout this season, is we've included a lot of different practices or methods for which to deliver, I guess you could call it content, but also a variety of faces of people that are involved in this Advent calendar, because our hope is, to really sort of display what is happening in our community so that we can have a sense of experiencing the community during the season of Advent. So to my question, after having said that, after acknowledging that everything has changed, what would you say have been some of our strengths or some of our gifts as a community as we've adjusted from what has been since our inception every single Sunday, in the beginning twice a Sunday, but since once a Sunday, to suddenly everything's off campus, everything's online? What would you say have been some things that have popped up in our community that have had you going, yeah, this is the progress we need to make, and what are some things that have stood out to you that are positive?
Yeah, I mean the biggest pro, and like I think it also has to be said, right? Like, I'm brand new to the Redeemer community here in Sarnia.
Correct.
My most familiar church experience is in Thunder Bay, with those that I abandoned to come here. But no, like, I think the biggest gift, there's just a pattern that exists within churches that often after a season of being without a pastor and that leadership role being filled, it's very wearing on a community. Mm-hmm. And so I think the biggest gift that we were given was that all of a sudden everything was kind of put on ice and given a break. Hmm. I haven't quite phoned or visited everybody within the community. I'm pretty close to the end of officially checking boxes, but you almost can't have a conversation without somebody at some point referencing the sort of Sabbath, the restfulness that comes with that season. And as a result, it's kind of affirming for some of the things like bringing sermons online, having videos that aren't time, space, or place like dependent, right? It reinforces this reality that, look, for years we've said the reason to come to church is a sermon. And we've just spent months listening to the reality that that's not true. So you can get your sermon on your couch or wherever you're going to listen to it to. But what are those other pieces that remain, right? And this has been probably the most contentious thing to talk about, because everybody has a different opinion about what's left or what remains to be gathered together. Yeah. Right? Like, you've got your group that really wants the arts, right? They want the song, the visuals, the connections, right? Like, and we are absolutely, with your help and with the help of others, really learning to pull those things into the experiences that we offer, mm-hmm. right? Even just beyond content, right? Like, because watching these videos, they're videos, but you're part of the conversation. Like, we anticipate a group of people sitting on the other side, right? Yeah. So, that's one of those things.
Yeah, and to jump in right there, one of the pieces that I've observed kind of underpinning that sort of anxiety has been this sense of loss of community, because that's exactly what has taken place. So we can't underscore enough the loss of community as a result of government shutdowns and stuff. But to speak to that strength, that's one of the strengths I've noticed in this community, is that there's this deep longing from everyone, that there was this, in part, understanding that the Sunday morning was this experience where I heard a sermon, and that maybe have in the past had been a primary motivator for Sunday attendance.
Yeah, maybe not
but
here.
What's being felt and what's being experienced is the loss of the community that's experienced in that Sunday morning event. Right. And I've observed that as a gift of this community, is that this community is very tight, very drawn into experiencing community together and saying to one another, how do we make progress? And I think that shift has been so sudden and so different. It's shifted. It's shaken us, I guess, at our core of how do we continue to identify what's most important?
Yeah, well, and I think the challenge. So, like, I've just been like listening to people's comments, right, and trying to understand what they mean when they say they feel like they've lost a sense of community. Mm-hmm. And I'm not convinced that everybody is talking about the same thing together.
True.
Right? Like,
yep.
Like even you and I would have differing opinions as to what that loss of community would look
Correct.
like, right? Like,
yeah, absolutely.
I think one of the things that what I'm noticing as I'm listening to it, though, and like hearing what people are telling me is when it comes down to this community piece is really as it relates to like our roles in a pastoral capacity. I think it's that loss of spiritual community, right? And those lines are blurred between like social community sometimes and like these other benefits that come with being a part of a church. Mm-hmm. And like other people find them all over the place, but it's that real sort of spiritual piece, right? Like, who are the people that you see every week that, on this for you and I looking in, it looks like superficial conversation. Hey, how are you? How you doing? Yeah. But the longer you're in a community, you'll know that those conversations happen, and then some point during the week, there's a phone call made and a long conversation about the concern that was expressed ever so fleetingly, right? Like, and I feel like that in those interactions is like what's been sacrificed the most.
Yeah.
And there's some that I think they're having them, they just don't recognize it, right? Like, because they have a different group of people that have existed within their bubble.
So this is actually a really good place for me to jump in here. Where would you say focus is needed in order to rekindle that spiritual sensation or that loss of spiritual connection with one another? Where would you say we need to focus? Where do we need to really dive into ways as a community in which to experience those things?
Yeah. The way you frame the question, it sounds like I've got the right answer, but like I don't. Like I'm just Holy Spirit guessing here.
Yeah, I'm trying to push us deeper. So, we could be making all of this up. We most likely are. Let's be honest.
No, I think so. What we've been articulating in like meetings that we're having within the different groups that are working. And with different people that we're meeting with, and when we do our ministry team Q&As and all of those things, is this notion of like meeting people where they are at, right? Like, and I think the reality of that, as it relates to your question, is this is where it's complex because we get stretched in so many different directions. Because although there's this sort of universal tagline, "We miss community." Everybody is in a different place on that question.
So I'm going to twist your brain a little bit here, because I like where this is going, and I want to just kind of pull you in a little bit here. But like, what needs to be given up in order to get to that place of focus?
Yeah.
Because I think this is one of the realities, at least myself, that I struggle with, and trying to stay focused on our topic here of hopefulness.
Right.
But like, I think that this is where it feels like, let's return to this topic of COVID and how this season has felt like, we've been waiting forever. And, like how do we focus on experiencing Christian community in a new way? Right. But this question specifically of what needs to be given up, that's where I've started to realize that I need to, the only thing that I can really change, and I think we all know this, is ourselves. But what do I need to give up in order to experience that community? That question has really, as you begin to sit with that question and begin to reflect on that, I guess in your own context, I feel like that's one of the questions that now needs to be had, because you've alluded to it already, but we can't just continue to pile on to stuff that we've hung on to, that's been part of our past and part of our history.
Correct.
And look to the future and be like, okay, let's experience this new thing without letting go of some of those things that have held us in place in the past. So what would you say needs to be let go of?
Yeah, you've bought me enough time to like find answers. So, I think at the largest level, I think the reality is that as a church community, not specific to here, I think just every church community probably has to do this inventory work of saying, look, there is no like going back to the way things were. So just let go of that language, right? Like, you're in ministry today. You're going to be in ministry tomorrow. And when I say ministry, you're in a relationship with God at some level of maturity and should be working at growing in that relationship.
Yeah.
And sharing the joy of that relationship with somebody else.
Yeah.
So they might find the comfort and the hope of it, right? Like,
yeah.
So I think that for me, the on a big level, it's just like let go of the phrase.
Yeah.
Right? Like, you have to think, given the circumstances today,
Yeah.
how are we going to function together?
Yeah.
Right? Put it towards that sort of applied, like, what can we do?
Yeah. So what can, like honestly, like, practically, like, rooted somewhere, what steps forward do you feel that we are in a place to take? And secondly, who is needed?
Yeah.
Like if we need to, let go of everything that's held us in the past, what are those steps forward that we can take? What and who is needed in order to take those steps? Because we're speaking now, about this lost sense of spiritual connection with our community. We're speaking also about the hopefulness of Advent. I mean, who is needed, and how do we go forward?
The reality is everyone is needed, right? Like, I think for a while, as churches, move towards sort of the quote unquote professional reliance on anything and everything, right? Like from the pastoral care all the way down to cleaning services, let's say, right? Like, anything that falls within those spectrums of jobs, right, behind the scenes versus up front. There's been a sort of a mentality that we pull away from serving ourselves and we kick it to somebody who's paid to do it. Now, I'm not. Don't hear me wrong. Like, don't hear me wrong. I'm not about to say let's quit paying for people to be committed to these things, right? Like, this is the biblical reality, right? Paul's whole journey, right? Like, I'm sure he was actually pretty good at leatherworking, but he was more valued by the community to be doing the work of ministry. And so we will take care of you. Stop doing that. So you still need, I think communities, if they can afford it, still need those people to do like the grunt work, so that it's easy for people to enter into the volunteer stuff.
Yeah.
So for example, like within all this video content that we're producing, it was always there before, we're just recording it and sharing it now, right?
Correct.
Like,
yes.
You would have had all these pieces before, maybe arranged differently.
Correct.
But they would have all been there.
Correct.
You just would have had to know to show up at this time at the church.
Yeah. And this is an absolute testimony to those experiences.
Right. And we've gotten really good at doing whatever, event is, show up at the church and, do it. And we let people be the audience.
Correct.
But we're in a spot where we don't need audience members necessarily. Like, we do, in the sense, like, the message is always for somebody to hear and receive.
Yeah.
But we need participants. We need people beside us doing this stuff. Yeah.
So I know one of the pieces that we were reflecting at a recent leadership meeting, and one of the realizations was that when we're experiencing those moments of like loneliness and separation and isolation, and which are very common moments for all of us during this time of trying to live wisely. The observation was made by one of the members present to say, like, I just had this realization the other day that I need to pick up my phone and be the one to initiate. I need to pick up the phone to be the one to say, like, I'm lonely, I need to talk to somebody. And if I'm feeling this way, I'm sure somebody else out there was. And so I just got on my phone, I made that phone call, and I realized it was that simple. And I think that's why I share that story, because it can be overwhelming to hear, like, oh, everybody's needed. But what's needed, I think, is actually way more simple than that. It's not this huge, complex, we need you to sit on council so that you can think through all the strategies of the church and help us get us from point A to point B. No, it's actually much simpler than that. It's maybe the things that you're already doing in your communities. It's reframing them in a way that reminds you of, like, there's a purpose behind doing
well, and like in line with the reframing thing, right? Like, so again, right? Like, think ministry as it is today.
Yeah.
Right. Like, so Redeemer exists in a variety of spheres, right? Like, we have our physical gatherings a couple times a month. Outside of holiday season, that'll be every other week. Until we change that to probably, never will cross the doors of Redeemer. Yeah. And I love that. I think that's fantastic.
And I think, like, because that's where I was hoping to arrive, is like what's already available for our communities. If you didn't hear those things, right. I just want to make a Discord, stop, pause, right? And say, like, hey, look, we have these things available. You can participate if you're on the west coast of North America, or if you're I have family in Europe. And we don't know who's going to watch this. Maybe you're just hiding in a basement in Minnesota. We don't know. Our point is we do have these places in which you can connect to our community. Discord being a crucial one. That's where the community has conversation. It's often people are there just making little notes from time to time. We also have Facebook. Facebook is just going to ping you and say, hey, look, something's happening at the church. Most of the time it's a video's been posted, but it's also resources.
Well, and that's the reality of it, is like in your physical gathering of church, there are different layers of like involvement.
Correct.
And with the online community that we're slowly putting like small pieces on top of the next piece, there's layers to it, right? So, everything that comes via YouTube is kind of the broadest spectrum, right? Like, and then you have to have made a little bit of effort to click a link to get to Facebook.
Correct.
And now, you'll get notifications because it'll come across your news feed. But Discord really invites that sort of the ability to live online in community.
Correct.
Because if you've not been on it, or if you have been on it, you'll know, right? Like, there's channels that go down the left side. Most of them are text, and at the very bottom are chat rooms, basically, where if you clicked in, you could talk and actually see people if you wanted. But those chat channels really allow us to sort of direct a type of conversation in an area. So, for example, some of my favorites are... there's the Sanctuary. So I go to that one because I'm always looking to hear how people are interacting with the sermons. It's not from a vain sort of standpoint. It's just it's hard to assess your own sermon. Well, it's hard to get your assessment right. I've had plenty of sermons where I'm like, oh yeah, that was a great one. And then you meet people and they're like, no, that was not great.
Yeah.
And then you have other ones where you're like, oh, that was a dud. And then you meet people and they're like, that was amazing.
Yeah.
And you're like, well, the Spirit does amazing things. Yeah. So, I like to listen to comments there. There's the prayer room.
Yeah.
And right at the beginning of COVID, that was used more than it has been most recently. Most recently, the kind of activity that'll swell is in the Advent calendar, where it's like all these sort of like scattered posts come to one place, right?
Yeah. And that's our invitation to you to join that online conversation room. It allows you to participate in ways that you want to and in ways that make sense for you. Maybe... And we just see that as an opportunity to get to know one another and how, my hope for Discord in the context of the ongoing Advent calendar and our conversation here is that we'll be able to have conversation in Discord of how we're meeting that content and how we're interacting with it. I know that our family is very intentional about okay, if this is our practice today, we want to try to achieve that. And
well, I mean, you're saying it, but continuing on with that question that you asked earlier about like what people are doing now, right? Like how can they? The reality is in just a couple of words, I would say buy-in.
Yeah.
You just have to buy into it all.
Yeah.
You could have dragged your heels for the last whatever months or years, but just stop. You're doing yourself a disfavor.
Yeah.
And just buy into it. And I'm a person who drags my heels unless I can see it right away.
Yeah.
But I know that there's always these things that you're kind of pushed into.
Yeah.
And you get there and you're like, oh, that was actually way more life-giving than I thought it was going to be. But like when you think about like involvement too, right? Like in terms of buy-in, some of that is not even just like pick up a phone call. You don't need to know people.
Right.
Respond to messages that you're seeing in Discord as you would a conversation anywhere else in your life.
Yeah.
Invite your friends that make your own real life worthwhile.
Yeah.
Invite them into the digital space so that they can help make the digital space equally worthwhile.
Yeah.
And that's what I mean when I say like we need everybody.
Yeah.
Because from the least to the greatest, there is work to be done.
Yeah.
And some of it is just really simple, like you mentioned, right? Like it's not complex.
Yeah.
Type of message.
Yeah.
But it's challenging because I think the hard work of it is that it hasn't been part of our rhythms.
Correct.
For so many people.
Yeah.
And now it has to become part of our rhythms, right?
It does. Yeah.
Even for myself, loving the digital space, it's not in my own rhythm to be an active participant in an online forum like that. I tend to be a more passive observer. And so you've got to kind of like give yourself that Holy Spirit push and do the work, right? So.
Well, I feel like this has been really great. First, this is awesome. Yeah. I think we should do this more frequently.
We think this is great. Maybe you don't.
Yeah. Most people will watch 2 minutes of it, let's be honest.
Which I'll be able to tell in the analytics how much people are watching. Yeah.
Not enough. Okay, self-plug over. Thank you for joining us. We're really excited for this season of hope. I just think it's such a great perspective of which to look at what the meaning of Christmas is for us as Christians. Jesus is our ultimate hope. It's what we place all of our belief in. And
your hope today, your hope tomorrow.
And I'm just so excited that we're celebrating that in a meaningful way as a community. Thank you, if you did make it this far, for taking the time to join us today. We'll check in with you soon. Merry Christmas.
Yeah, well, and I would just go invite you to continue on the conversation, right? The reality is we're at a round table, so there are people on the other side. So send private messages to us if you want, that you don't want it public, right? Like start somewhere comfortable for you, but continue on the conversation. So answer that question. Like maybe there's two that you want to answer. What are the things that you're going to have to give up? Or instead, maybe what are the things that you're looking to try and do? We'd love to see how you're living into hope this year.
Merry Christmas.
See you.